Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this special virtual event on COP28. What happened and where did we go from here? Welcome to everybody who's joining online. I'm sure we're all experts on Zoom now after the pandemic, but just to remind you, because this is a Zoom webinar, the audience can see the panelists, but can't interact directly with them apart from putting Q&A questions. So if you're a member of the audience, you can ask a question at any time by going to the Q&A function and putting in your question. Please put in details of who you are and where you're from. It always helps if you can do that. And then at the end, after we've had the 10-minute introductions from each of the panelists, we will then go to Q&A. So don't put your questions in the chat because we can't see them, and we will then be able to see how you voted for the questions. So just to introduce me, I'm Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. We have an excellent panel who I will introduce now. We have Alison Campbell, who is the Chief UK Climate Negotiator based at the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and Alison played a key role in the negotiation process in Dubai, particularly around the text of the Global Stocktake. We also have Professor Lord Nicholas Stern, who is chair of the Grantham Research Institute and co-chair of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, who published their second report at COP28. We also have Timo Leiter, who's a researcher at the Grantham Research Institute and was heavily involved in the discussions around the global goal on adaptation in Dubai. Then we have Jodian Wang, who's also a policy fellow here at the Grantham Research Institute and was heavily involved in the discussions around the just transition at COP28. And then we have Elena Avrachenkova, who will be talking about national implementation of the COP decisions. So each of them are going to talk for 10 minutes, an introduction, and then we'll go to Q&A. We are recording this event, so everybody should be aware of that. And we will seek to finish on time at 12:30 UK time. So going to start by asking Alison to start. The other panelists are going to turn their cameras off briefly, and then we will then move on. So Alison, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, and morning, everybody. It's great to have a chance to reflect on COP so soon after it's finished. So looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel as well. But I'll focus mostly on the negotiated outcome, and maybe just to start with how it felt going in. I think going into COP28, you could really feel the difficult geopolitical context. We knew there was a lot at stake with the year of the Global Stocktake, being a pretty critical year. And to be frank, it felt a little bit undercooked going in for the negotiations, especially in terms of not having a text on the table for the Global Stocktake. And I think we were all worried about what we would be able to deliver, especially after having had really difficult dynamics in the G20. And so, despite the efforts of the presidency, I think, it felt difficult going in. Maybe just to say that the UK, we had 5 objectives, I would say, going in. So the first was to get a package of outcomes that would keep 1.5 in reach. And I think the main things we were focused on there were really reflecting the science and the need to peak by 2025. focusing on the tripling of renewables and the doubling of energy efficiency targets, language on fossil fuel phase out, and also guidance to the next round of nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. We thought they would be critical parts of the package. The second objective was around adaptation, where we wanted to agree the global goal and adaptation framework, and we needed to take extra steps on the doubling of adaptation finance. Third was around loss and damage, where we really wanted to see the fund agreed at COP. Fourth was around finance, really demonstrating the delivery on the 100 billion goal, and plus looking at how we could move further on, shifting into the trillions and really embedding work on Article 21C and accelerating finance flows. And then the fifth was on nature and looking at how we could take all the good work that's been done on nature over the last few years and really embed it into a COP outcome through the Global Stocktake. So I guess that's what we had gone in wanting. And I do think overall it felt like we took a step forward in all of them. I think there's clearly mixed feelings about the outcome, but I think that's reflective of the different contexts that we needed to navigate. And obviously the language on fossil fuels grabbed the headlines, and I'll come on to that later. But overall, I think from our perspective, COP delivered at the higher end of our expectations, even if it wasn't perhaps the giant leap forward that we know we all needed. And I think it's also worth saying that the UAE presidency was really active and put a lot of effort into getting good outcomes from the COP. And I think that made a difference. So maybe just to go through each of those areas in turn, and I'll start with loss and damage, because I think that really framed the COP outcome. I think it was a really good idea from the UAE to try and agree that decision at the start in the opening plenary, and to get some momentum around with pledges coming forward. So the UK had been involved in the transitional committee, and we were very supportive of the outcome that had come out on the fund, and we wanted the decision to be adopted. So from our perspective, it was really important that the fund was open to all developing countries, but with a focus on the particularly vulnerable, and that we were able to mobilise finance for it from a wide range of sources. And a recognition it's not something that only the traditional donors can do. So from our perspective, the outcome of the transitional committee had done that, and so we wanted to see it agreed. And I think the fact that it was really gave some momentum, and also the scale of the pledges that came forward really showed how seriously the donors were taking this. I think over $700 million to get the fund up and running. Again, obviously not near the scale that's needed for loss and damage, but in terms of getting a fund going and giving momentum, I think was really important. And the UK pledged $60 million for loss, that £60 million, I should say, for loss and damage, including £40 million for the fund. And I think that gave momentum to the rest of COP. And there were some other announcements as well around the beginning that gave things a boost, like some contributions to the Green Climate Fund. And I think, importantly, the expectation from the OECD that donors had met the 100 billion goal in 2022. So I think that was a big step forward, even at the start on loss and damage. And then maybe coming through to what we then needed to deliver to keep 1.5 in reach. All of this was really in the context of the Global Stocktake. And I think I spoke on this panel last year after Sharm el-Sheikh, and we were concerned that we had not done nearly enough to move forward on the 1.5 agenda. And I've already hinted at the package that we thought was going to be needed. So in terms of what we got from this in the UAE, so first of all, science was really critical to us, and the fact that was reflected in the text was really important. There was a lot of reference to the IPCC reports. We got the clear benchmark that there needs to be 60% reduction by 2035, which was really important given the need for the Global Stocktake outcome to guide the next round of NDCs. And we got an acknowledgement of the need to peak global greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. Now, that fell short of the commitment to peak, which is what we had wanted, but nonetheless, I think is an important benchmark and acknowledgement. I think onto the second part on tripling of renewables and doubling energy efficiency. This was the first time we'd agreed sectoral targets like that at COP in a decision text. I think really translating some of the work that's been done outside the negotiating space, including through the Clean Energy Pledge, and putting it into the text as kind of global benchmarks for countries to work towards, I think is going to shift the way we do things in a positive way. And the third part of that package on the fossil fuel language, as I said, that got all of the attention. I think especially with the way it was reflected in the first text that the presidency put out on the Global Stocktake, where the formulation was pretty weak, and there was a could attached. So, here are some things that you could do if you wanted to, which just wasn't strong enough for us and for many countries there. And I think there was a real push from the High Ambition Coalition and other countries to increase the strength of that language. We had gone looking for a phase out of unabated fossil fuels, and that is not exactly the language that was in the final text. But I do think the language that we ended up with in the final package, which was transitioning away from fossil fuels with an important emphasis that has to start this decade, and then an end point in that it's towards net zero in energy systems by 2050. I think we regard that as a phase out in all but name. And I think it's also the first time we've been specific about net zero by 2050 in a COP decision text. So in terms of the signal that it sends, I think that's important. I do think it can be interpreted in different ways, and the key will be how it actually gets taken forward. And I think there was also some language that was included that I know the islands in particular were pointing at loopholes, and I think we would agree there is a risk there around the abatement language, although it's focused on hard to abate sectors. The role of CCS was highlighted in the decision text, and also I think the role of transitional fuels being highlighted in the decision text caused some discomfort, but was clearly needed to get some countries along with the package. The final thing from that part that we were a bit disappointed about is that we didn't really progress the coal language from Glasgow away from phase down, but nonetheless important that it was recognised in that list of things that countries should do. And I think overall that package was pretty, it was the landmark language from COP, and as I say, how it gets taken forward is going to be the key. And then maybe the final thing, just one of the things that's important but hasn't got a lot of attention necessarily is the guidance for the next round of NDCs. Firstly, that they should be NDCs to 2035. But I think the real big step forward comes with an encouragement that all parties should be coming forward with economy-wide targets that cover all greenhouse gases. And critically, that these should be aligned with 1.5 degrees. So there's a few things here. I think firstly, like really cementing 1.5 as the new goal. And now when any country comes forward with its NDC, it's going to have to explain how their NDC aligns with 1.5 and why they consider that to be a fair contribution. But also, there are many countries, including in the G20, that don't currently have targets that cover all greenhouse gases. And I think that's an important step forward as well. We had wanted to go a little bit further and push for absolute targets so that every country to have an emission reduction against a base year, which we didn't get in the final outcome. But I think nonetheless, that's a big step forward on the next round of NDCs. And we also saw some stronger language on non-CO2 gases in the text as well. So I think that package on 1.5, we felt, although it wasn't everything we wanted, it moved us forward. Onto the third element on adaptation. So pleased that we agreed the framework for the global goal and adaptation. I know there are others on this call who are going to go into more detail on that, so I won't. But it's obviously something that had been, there'd been a lot of focus on this year, and it was important that we made progress on it. And we've got some new thematic targets covering water, food, health, ecosystems, infrastructure, livelihoods, cultural heritage, which I think was important, and also some new global process targets, really more around how you do risk assessment, planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And I think that should really focus and guide work on adaptation within the kind of UNFCCC context, which has been quite elusive over the past few years. and there's a lot of work still to do to bring that to life. But I think it was a positive outcome there. Obviously, also linked to adaptation finance, and another important outcome from our perspective from COP was that donors agreed to provide more transparency on the goal of doubling adaptation finance. That was an important thing for us as the UK, having pushed that in COP26. And I think the recognition that the doubling is just the floor is important as well. And that's obviously going to be a part of the new finance goal discussions next year, which takes me on to the fourth part around finance. So again, others on the call, much more expert than me, will speak more broadly to this. But I think the reassurance on the 100 billion going into COP was important. I think it was a fairly strange COP on finance, largely because the negotiations on the new goal to, after the 100 billion are happening next year. And so it was difficult to see what we could agree this year in a negotiated context beyond what we got, which was kind of clear acknowledgement that more needs to be done. I think particularly, as I said, on adaptation, but also on financing the energy transition. But there wasn't a huge amount in terms of specificity in the decision text. I think a lot was going on outside the room, which others will speak to more. And also we did get some important steps forward on how we can take forward work to align finance flows with the Paris Agreement, Article 21C. And I think we got some good momentum around the Bridgetown agenda, and also a number of countries endorsing a leader-level finance framework that was brokered by the UAE, which I think will set important context for next year as well. And then finally, onto nature. So that the main point I would make here is that we really did manage to embed some of the things from pledges in previous COPs into a decision text. So we got agreement for the first time of the net zero deforestation by 2030 target in a decision text through the Global Stocktake. And I think that was important alongside the continued focus on nature outside the room, where the UAE were pushing it as one of their key themes. And then maybe just to finish with wrapping up a few of the bits. So from our perspective, we had a really disappointing outcome on the mitigation work programme. But our hope is that was because the Global Stocktake was dealing with the political aspects of mitigation this year, and we expect much more from that in coming years. We also agreed the Just Transition Work Programme, which is clearly going to be an important track going forward, and that was a positive step. So I would say a mixed bag in some respects, but I do think that taken together, we felt that the UAE consensus documents really represented progress. I think particularly on fossil fuels, and whilst it doesn't by itself keep 1.5 in reach, I do think it gives us the opportunity to do that if we act to the full potential. And the key to all of this, as always, is how it's going to be followed up, how countries, how businesses respond to that signal on fossil fuels, how countries incorporate the Global Stocktake outcomes in their NDC planning going forward, how we take all of this into the new goal negotiations next year on finance. Because that's clearly going to be where the focus is going to shift. So I think I've probably used my time, so I'll maybe end there. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. That's a fantastic summary of all the issues across the decisions in the UAE consensus. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the Q&A for you. I can see some already arriving. I think it's worth reminding everybody at this stage that the COP process is a consensus-driven process. So people often ask about the difficulties of, why is it so slow? Why is it so difficult? I mean, when you think you're trying to get consensus between 197 countries, I often marvel at the fact that we make any progress. But it's been, there is certainly more momentum coming out of this COP than last year, for instance. So thank you very much, Alison. So we'll move on to the next speaker, which is Nick Stern, who's going to talk about the finance issues. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Alison. That was absolutely tour de force in explaining such a complicated process and outcome. I've been to all the COPs since 2006, and you always have expectations, and sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. I think this was a COP where many of us had quite modest expectation, but the outcome did actually exceed, and significantly exceed, the modest expectation. So when people ask me for a one-liner, I say that this was a significant but not huge step forward, and it could have been a significant step backwards. So I do think it was a good COP, although not a spectacularly good COP. I would like to pay tribute to the leadership of Alison. The reviews of who did what when and significance of interventions were hugely positive about Alison, and I think we should recognize and celebrate that contribution. She's in a line of really wonderful leaders in UK negotiations. Pete Betts for so long, and sadly we lost Pete to cancer earlier this year. And the last thing many of us did before leaving for COP was to attend Pete's memorial gathering in Clapham, and then a big part of the congregation set off for Heathrow to go to Dubai. But Pete had that wonderful tradition. It was succeeded by Archie Young, also an outstanding leader, and now Alison. So thank you very much, Alison. This has been an area where the UK in these COPs has done a tremendous job, sometimes with good governments and sometimes with less good governments, but our civil service leadership has always been extremely good. The COPs are partly the outcome documents and negotiations which Alison has been through so clearly and strongly, but it is also very big interactions. And there were more than 100,000 people there in Dubai. And of course, the majority were not the negotiators. They were private sector, NGOs and so on. And the interactions which are now taking place at COP, I think, are very important. It is now the place to go where if you're interested in sustainable development and you need to catch up and you need to interact with people, that is where you should be. And I think that is a very valuable tradition, and I hope it will continue. The last thing I wanted to say before I move to the finance part of the story is COP30 in Brazil. Looking back, and I say I've been to all the COPs since 2006, there has been good progress when the run up to the COP has been longer. Alison drew attention to the absence of really detailed texts ahead of the COP. But if you have a 2-year program, then you can actually go into the COP with a lot of the framework already there. If you look back at Paris 2015, it was very closely interwoven with the Lima Peru COP of 1 year earlier. And so much of the work was done over that 2-year period with very close relationship with and leadership from Peru as well as and Lima, as well as from France and Paris. The COP26 in Glasgow, I think, was a very important step forward. And that was a COP where there was a 2-year run because of COVID. So I do think that the 2-year run is important, and now we have a 2-year run up to COP30, and our Brazilian friends are already very active. So I hope that that will be a very positive one. Azerbaijan, of course, will be on the way, but I think we should see this as largely a 2-year run to Brazil, where there's a real chance we could have major step forward. And I think that would include on finance. So let me very quickly speak about that, which was my designated subject. Amar Bhattacharya, Virasongwe and I, working very closely with Eleanor Subrana, took a report to COP28. That's the summary of the report is on the website, describing how the investment necessary for delivery on Paris could be financed. So our report on a climate finance framework was for finance with a purpose. What purpose? Delivery on the investment. What investment? That investment which delivers on Paris. So we presented that report. I'll say something about that report. It was launched at a very big meeting, very well attended, with finance ministers, leaders of multilateral development banks, private sector, and so on, and pretty well received. It built on the work of a year ago, where we did a similar kind of report for COP27, but we did much more detail on acceleration and implementation this time. So we start with investment, and the Global Stocktake, which showed that over this decade, we might well not reduce emissions very much at all, when we know that something like 40% or so emissions reductions over this decade would be necessary for holding 1.5 within reach. Why was it that that Global Stocktake presented that really rather bad picture of emissions reductions, or almost the absence of emissions reductions in aggregate? The reason was we have not invested enough in the new and the clean in order to be able to run down the old. The Global Stocktake screamed at us that there was a deficiency in investment. And the way we'd set up our work was to ask what investment was necessary in order to deliver on Paris, and then how to finance it. So it's deductive. It's what finance is necessary for delivery. It's not a negotiating position. It's a deductive story of what kinds of finance are necessary to deliver what kinds of investments, recognizing that different kinds of investments require different kinds of finance. The areas of investment which we focused on, and we focused on emerging markets and developing economies outside China. China, of course, extremely important, but doesn't need external finance. So we focused on emerging markets and developing economies outside China, and argued that the investment needs were around 2.4 trillion a year as a flow in those countries by 2030. So 2.4 trillion a year in those countries by 2030. That covers the energy transition, adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital, all consistent with Paris. So that's a flow, an overall flow that needs to be financed. That would be financed from 4 broad areas: domestic resource mobilization, private sector, multilateral development banks, and highly concessional finance which largely does not require debt service. So those were the 4 areas that we described in rank order of quantity: domestic resource mobilization, private sector, MDBs, and highly concessional or grant or not debt service bearing finance. So that was the rubric. I haven't got time to go through all the numbers in detail here, but it is important that to recognize that rank order. And we had 1.4 billion financed internally, domestic resource mobilization, and 1 trillion external. So our description of the flows of finance externally to those countries necessary to deliver on Paris are roughly 1 trillion a year in 2030. More than half private sector, 300 or so, 350 billion from multilateral development banks, and the remainder of 150 billion or so from those very low cost sources. So that, of course, is much bigger than the 100 billion that we've been talking about for so long, and which Alison mentioned. I was there in Copenhagen in 2009 as part of the negotiations for the 100 billion, and the 100 billion was exactly that. It was a negotiated sum, one that we thought was far too small. I was negotiating on behalf of Africa very closely with Meles Zenawi, not on the side of the rich countries. The flows that we're talking about now are much bigger than that, and they're deductive flows. They're not negotiated flows. For the private sector, very big increase in investment flows that we would need, 10 or 15 times extra in the private sector relative to now. We are going to need risk sharing and risk reduction through partnering with the multilateral development banks. And that will require that they triple their financing by 2030. That was the conclusion we came to last year. That was the conclusion of the N.K. Singh and Larry Summers report, which was requested by the G20 Indian presidency, which we were very much part of it. Veera Songway and I were part of that expert group, and Amar Bhattacharya working very closely with it, as was Elena Subarao. So that story has been there now for a year. It has been actually broadly understood and recognized in terms of its deductive nature and the numbers that are necessary. So it's delivery on that is enormously important. I believe the scale and the nature of those things is increasingly shared. We've had in the recent past Bridgetown, we've had the Macron summit in June, the new global pact, and we've had the President Ruto summit after that in Kenya. Again, those kinds of numbers and that finance for a purpose story has been recognized. Very importantly, the N.K. Singh Larry Summers report, which we were part of, was welcomed by the finance ministers of the G20 in Marrakesh at the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, and it was welcomed by the heads of the multilateral development banks. So there's real momentum building there, and I do hope that through this year we're able to maintain that momentum. Lots more detail that I could give, but we simply don't have time to do that. But I do think new forms of international taxation, for example, on maritime, may start to become an active area of discussion. The fact that you're on screen, Bob, means that my time is up, I assume.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for giving that again a high-level overview of all the work in this area, and I'm sure we'll get some specific questions in the Q&A afterwards. We're going to move on next to Timo Leiter, who's going to talk about the adaptation decisions specifically around the global goal on adaptation. I think Timo, you're going to share your screen to show some slides.
Yes, correct. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, Alison and Nick. I'm going to focus on the adaptation outcomes at the COP, and in particular, the framework for the global goal on adaptation, which was one of the kind of tangible deliverables after the GST decision. So I have also been in the negotiations since 2015. Following very closely the adaptation negotiations, and I've been in the room and actually also co-facilitating some of the workshops that took place throughout this year. But giving you first a very brief background where the adaptation negotiations came from, basically, or what the background is. So the Paris Agreement includes the global goal on adaptation, which basically is summarized in these bullet points, which you see here: enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability in the context of the temperature goal. The developing countries in particular have pushed for more work on adaptation in the context of this global goal on adaptation, which is a qualitative goal. So in Glasgow at COP26 under the UK presidency, a work program has been decided over 2 years on the GGA, and that work program ended now at the COP. So the exciting question was, okay, what would the outcome be? And in fact, last year at the midpoint of this work program, it was decided to initiate the development of a framework for the GGA. So this entire year, 2023, through 4 workshops and through the negotiations in Bonn and the negotiations just now at the COP, this framework has been developed. So let's have a look about some of the key kind of topics that were discussed. So basically, of course, it's a challenge to develop a global framework for a topic that is as context specific as adaptation is. So one of the debates was about the structure of the framework itself. You know, how should this be organized? Should there be different hierarchies of things? Should it be about political signals? Should it be about targets? And we've just heard from Alison also that mitigation targets have been agreed for the first time under the GST decision. so there was no precedent for something like that. So the question for adaptation was also, should there be specific sectoral targets? Should there be financial targets around means of implementation? And how would this link to the global stocktake, which happened basically in parallel, created another challenge, and how to measure progress on adaptation globally, and also what should happen after this year's COP. So these are the main issues that were debated. Countries made submissions and observers as well. I also wrote the submission, which you see here for LSE. And so before we see what was actually agreed, one more slide on some of the details of the negotiation. So, for example, one of the debates was whether this framework could basically be a support instrument for adaptation in developing countries, or whether it should be a global and applicable to all adaptation framework. Adaptation, of course, is very context specific. Countries face very different climate risks. So it's not easy to create a framework that's applicable to all, but yet accounts for all different national circumstances. One consensus that was achieved mid this year was already all countries did not want any prescription. They did not want a blueprint on how to do adaptation. They emphasized it has to be country driven, which at the same time creates a trade-off. You know, if you, on the one hand, you want specific guidance, but on the other hand, you say, don't tell us what to do. That's the trade-off. Means of implementation was, of course, a very strong element. So developing countries wanted very specific targets on financial support, capacity building, and technology transfer. Whereas developed countries generally said, okay, this would be discussed under the finance negotiations that Nick just talked about. And of course, in general, there is a difficulty of measuring adaptation progress. I wrote my entire PhD thesis on this topic because there are no global indicators for adaptation, and it's practically impossible to generate them. So the question is, what other meaningful ways of measuring progress can you have? So it occurred already at the mid of this year that countries agreed that it would not be possible to develop any such indicators this year for this COP. So that was not a surprise anymore that the GGA decision from COP28 did not include any indicators or metrics for adaptation, but they are still to be developed. So let's have a look at what actually got agreed, because all of these elements were largely left open in these 4 workshops. So it's quite exciting to see what would come out of this. And so this is the framework for the global goal on adaptation that just got adopted last week Wednesday, I think it was. So the purpose of the framework is to guide the achievement of the GGA and to guide the review of progress. However, this purpose has already been agreed last year, so this was not new. What was surprising is that there's no overarching political statement in the framework on adaptation. There is a general preambular to the decision that recalls the findings of the IPCC with concern and emphasizes the importance of adaptation, and also stresses that mitigation can reduce adaptation needs and costs. But there's no overarching political statement. That was really surprising, because at the last workshop, just a few months ago, we basically already had a structure that countries had agreed for such a higher level political statement, but it did not make it into the text. Instead, there are now 2 levels or 2 sets of targets. There is one set of thematic targets and one set of targets around the policy cycle. Interestingly, this is the wording used. So it says urges parties. Actually, it says urges parties and other stakeholders to work towards the achievement of these 7 thematic targets. There was a long debate in the workshops how these targets should be formulated. Several country proposals had more general targets that were more SDG-style targets. But developed countries insisted that these targets have to be climate change related. Therefore, you see the wording of these 6 or 7 targets are all related to climate resilience. And then we have the 4 targets, which also interestingly, countries are not urged, but it simply says decide that these 4 targets are part of the framework. So you see this leaves room, essentially leaves it voluntary for countries to work towards these the targets. But the ones for the policy cycle are significant. They demand that by 2030, every country should have a national risk assessment, should have a national adaptation planning instrument that is up to date, should implement that planning instrument and track its monitoring and implementation. So that's quite significant. It also emphasizes that it shall be country-driven, voluntary, and in accordance with national circumstances. Again, speaking to the call not to have prescription here. On means of implementation, there's no financial target or anything similar. Developing countries had basically requested to have a means of implementation target attached to every thematic or dimensional targets, which was not agreed to. Instead, there are many paragraphs that reiterate the importance of support, provision of support, and the seeking to close the financial gap. In an earlier draft, it said the size to close the financial gap, so that was not agreed to. So there are many paragraphs on adaptation finance, but nothing kind of specific under this framework. Instead, that will be discussed under the finance items. And finally, on the aspect of measuring progress, it was decided to have a work program on indicators that now is being tasked over the next 2 years. So with the timeline, as Nick mentioned, to Brazil, to develop a way of assessing progress towards the GGA and the framework. And the important aspect here will be with a view towards the second GST in 5 years from now. If this work program does come to a way of assessing progress and gets adopted at COP30, that will be then what can be taken to assess adaptation more systematically under the second GST. The final slide I have is now reflecting on, okay, what does that mean? Where does this leave us? So there have been all types of expectations on what this GGA framework would deliver. Some of the expectations were not really realistic. Some people, hope that this framework would solve grand issues like what is adaptation, what isn't adaptation. But there's only so much you can do in 4 or 5 pages of COP decision text. So what the exact effect of these targets will be remains to be seen. Obviously, countries can use this domestically. Civil service can speak to their ministers and say, hey, these are the agreed targets. This is what we ought to do. Have an adaptation plan, implement it, track it. So hopefully this can help in some country circumstances to have something more specific to what the Paris Agreement included. Means of implementation, I think for developing countries, but in general, they have been very pleased that the framework has been agreed to. They would have definitely liked to see more specifics on adaptation finance. So a stronger push for adaptation finance is expected in 2024. Also in the context of doubling adaptation finance, which developed countries agreed they would do by 2025. So in general, I think the effect of the framework is largely yet to be seen. But given where we were just half a year ago, when there was no agreement at all on even having targets, it is more than what might have seemed possible. And on the work program on indicators, it's yet to be seen, or it will be developed how this is done. I'm seeing Bob coming on. The final point I wanted to make is from the negotiations itself. Actually, the first week was highly frustrating. The Arab countries and like-minded development countries blocked any work on decision context. So going into week 2, we had no text, nothing. And which led to the highly unusual situation that the subsidiary body chairs themselves replaced the co-facilitators, and the ministerial facilitation on the DGA took place in parallel. So it's almost a miracle that in these 3 days we did get to the text that we have, but that also explains why the text seems not to be tidied up. There are many paragraphs and specific things. But anyway, it was one negotiator told me the GGA is too big to fail. So we did get a framework, and now the challenge for including us LSE is to make it work over the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Timo, and an excellent focus on the discussions around the global goal and adaptation, and a reminder that there are still some game playing goes on in the negotiation process, which is not always clear that it's designed to promote informed outcomes. But thank you, Timo. A reminder to the audience, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A and vote for your favorite questions. We'll come to them shortly, but we're going to move on now to Jodian Wang, who's going to talk about the discussions around just transition. So Jodian, over to you.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you so much for having me here. It's been really great hearing the insights gathered from the other agenda items, and indeed at this COP28, just transition as a topic, as an agenda item has also been elevated. There's a lot of discussions focused around what it is, who it serves, who needs to act, and what do we need to do about it and how we get there. Largely, this materialized in the agenda item on the establishment and the operationalization of a work program on just transition. Happy to share that it is now operationalized. It's established with, I think, a great deal of urgency and sufficient scope of coverage to consider the various aspects of just transition and relatedly climate justice. There will be ministerial roundtables as well as 2 dialogues each year in the lead up to the SV's mid-year as well as before annual COP. So I think our evaluation on the whole of the just transition work program and what is now set out to do, it was better than expected. There are a set of priorities to accelerate climate action by maximizing social opportunities and responding to the social challenges for people, for communities, for workers, for value chains, for consumers. And the work program will also flesh out what entails just transition pathways and address just transition for net zero in the context of adaptation and mitigation. I think these just transition pathways can be critical enablers for policymaking as well as for financial capital allocation in terms of the means of implementation to support a just transition. It will also have a focus on the workforce, including through social dialogue, social protection, and the recognition of labor rights, which was one of the first instances that was mentioned at all at a COP. And lastly, there will be one of the key content of discussion for the work program will focus on how international cooperation will enable just transitions. That in negotiations and in mentions of the just transition throughout the GST as well as other texts has been a source of grievance, particularly along the lines of between global north and global south. So we're happy to see that international cooperation will also be focused on in discussions with the work program. The Grantham Institute, specifically Professor Nick Robbins, presented at the first annual high-level ministerial roundtable on just transition, and the presentation actually focuses on why just transition is a critical enabler and driver for climate action and the various approaches that are being taken and the financing, the means of implementation that are used to support a just transition, and that presentation is on our website. So that's the first reflection on just transition in terms of the agenda, but it is so much more than that in the sense that just transition is actually such a cross-cutting issue across various agenda items. And one reflection taken away from COP is, I think now there's common consensus on the fact that the just transition needs to minimize social economic harms for people, maximize opportunities, and ensure that there are procedural justice when it comes to social dialogues and adequate representation. But what is still missing and perhaps lagging a bit behind is the system transformation element of a just transition that is currently not yet recognized to the same extent. Ultimately, what the global just transition is about is looking at the fundamental restructuring of systems that have created the climate crisis in the first place, whether that's production, consumption, fossil fuel-based energy systems, monopolistic food systems that drive hunger and famine, or the lack of dignified, decent jobs currently. So whether truly a just transition can happen is entirely dependent on how these different socioeconomic dynamics need to be reconciled and the impacts that they can unleash on broader society. And by focusing on the system transformation element, it actually allows for some of the grievances that I mentioned earlier between global north, global south countries when defining and approaching just transition to be reconciled and to be reckoned with. I think there's potential harm in solely limiting ourselves to reskilling when it focuses on just transition, because there's so much there's so much more to it, and we cannot simply reskill and achieve a just transition without restructuring unfair systems in the first place. All that is to say, I think this needs to be further brought into the Just Transition Work Program discussions, especially when designing the relevant pathways. Alongside that, not only the content of what will be discussed on the Just Transition Work Program, but also kind of the institutional arrangements of the Just Transition Work Program as well, to ensure that stakeholders are adequately represented and voices are adequately heard on the Just Transition. And all that is to say that parties and non-party stakeholders also have until February 15th of next year to submit their views on what needs to be undertaken by the work program. So that is definitely an opportunity to provide input as well. Now, what was mentioned earlier is kind of the sectoral focus in the mitigation discussions that obviously has a just transition element when it comes to scaling up renewables and achieving the triple double goal. But not only in the energy system do we see breakthrough when it comes to just transition. In the food system specifically, we saw at COP28 substantive discussion and new initiatives coming out that connects food, agriculture, and climate and biodiversity. There was the UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture that was signed by 159 countries, and that covers about 80% of the world's land. There was also the launching of the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transformation, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, released a roadmap on curbing climate change and hunger. And I think all of these set good precedents of pushing the frontiers of what just transition needs to look like across all aspects of climate action. Now, for the just transition to have teeth and for what was achieved at COP28 to hold weight and have a legacy, we need the means of implementation to firmly back any textual commitments on targets and goals. And that was one of the grievances that came out of discussions and the overall interpretation of COP28 outcomes. The lack of financing to support the various targets that were discussed and decided upon, and the loopholes, as Alison mentioned. And that leads to my third point, which is something that we repeatedly said at COP28, the just transitions are not free. The goal to transition away from fossil fuels, the global goal on adaptations Timo mentioned, loss and damage all require funding. And actually last year in the adaptation gap report, we saw a 15% dip in adaptation finance to around $21 billion. But on the flip side, every $1 billion invested in adaptation, particularly against coastal flooding, will actually lead to 14 billion prevention and economic damages. So we are hoping ahead of COP29 to see more finance-related discussions, and COP29 will kind of be seen as a big-ticketed item with a new collective quantified goal, which the transparency and the means and the contribution, the dispersal of it will have deep implications for justice as well. The GST text outcome highlighted the failure of not meeting the long-term finance goals, as mentioned previously, the 100 billion goals, but it didn't specify as much on how to make this up or move forward. That also has justice implications that we're hoping to see more at COP29 as well. Now, in terms of outside of the COP space, the just transition is still happening, and there's a lot of technical implementation happening across standard setters, financial regulators, and policymakers. And one thing that we're focusing on in the coming year at the Grantham Institute, specifically our work program on just transition finance, is looking at robust metrics and indicators to inform capital allocation and policy making. We know that corporate transition planning has taken the world by storm this year, but much more needs to be clarified around how to make sure that the transition planning being done today adequately embed just transition elements, as well as adaptation in nature. So I think watch this space, as we'll be doing some exciting work around metrics and indicators for just transition. Also on capital allocation for the just transition at COP28, our team launched a report with the Climate Bonds Initiative to support the mobilization of labeled debt market for just transition. So our first output from this work program looked at the necessity for the transition to take social justice into account and providing an overall framework for organizations' transition plans for bonds, looking at how GSS plus bonds could be used to finance a just transition. And that report is also available on our website. Now, I think my last point is to say that, as mentioned in the GST synthesis report, justice and equity is multidimensional. It's a multifaceted concept. And as earlier speakers paid their tribute to the legacy of others who have set the path for the outcomes at COP28, I think I want to pay tribute to civil society stakeholders, children, youth, women, indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, people with colors who have advocated for the justice agenda at COP28 loud and clear. And I think without their work, we wouldn't have seen the outcome that we did at COP28. We now have a goal, but we don't have much plan to back behind it. So moving forward, we're really hoping to see the pathway set out clear direction of travel on what is needed. We need to see the pledges turn into domestic legislation and fiscal reforms and alignment of financial flows, all with just transition being underpinned as the backbone of any equitable international corporation. So happy to kind of see the outcome at COP28 and looking forward to more and the establishment of the work program going forward to further elevate the just transition agenda at COP. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Jodie-Ann. Excellent on the just transition. A reminder, ask your questions in the Q&A. We've got one more speaker, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Alina, over to you.
Well, I think as other speakers have outlined, Global Stocktake very clearly revealed that we have ambition gap and credibility gap at the moment, which were both recognized in the final COP28 decision. And specifically, obviously, there is a need to increase pledges in terms of emission reductions, but also in terms of finance that others have talked about. But also, if we look at the current implementation of the pledges that have already been made, there were serious gaps recognized at this COP. The analysis by Net Zero Tracker leading into the COP showed that while net zero targets at the moment, on the face of it, cover 88% of global greenhouse gas emissions, many of those targets are actually misaligned with the scientific evidence and policy directives. For example, because most of them do not include plans to phase out fossil fuels. So at the moment, only 7% of emissions are covered by any kind of national commitment to phase out exploration, production, or use of coal, oil, or gas. And I think according to that net zero track analysis, 15% have pledged a full phase out of any fossil fuel at all. So in that context, I think the outcome of this COP clearly calling on parties to, the decisions that Alison has spoken about in terms of aiming for phase out of fossil fuels are definitely significant and a move in the right direction. So a lot of the discussions at the COP, which were actually outside of the negotiations and the various side events, high-level dialogues, technical dialogues, were about how do we address that ambition gap and also the credibility gap in terms of translating the pledges that countries made in their NDCs into the credible national implementation and specifically into the national legal frameworks and backing up that with capable governance infrastructure that can actually deliver on the changes that need to happen. And my agenda at the COP was very much contributing to those discussions and with other colleagues at GRI. One of the inputs that we brought into the COP was a report that we've published on the first day, or released on the first day of the COP, which looks at governance pathways for implementation of net zero targets, which asks the question, firstly, what drives political commitment of countries to net zero? And then what drives integration of that political commitment into the national climate governance? And there have been a lot of discussions at the COP involving different types of stakeholders focusing on that. So I'll share some highlights with you. So, excuse me, when we think about what drives political commitment by countries to net zero, through a number of case studies we have done and also research of available literature on net zero, What we found out is that in many cases, the decisive factor for domestic net zero commitment still remains the signal from the UNFCCC process, the Paris Agreement and the decisions around that, and also the peer pressure and drive for kind of regional and international leadership. And we have done case studies looking at both developing countries such as highly vulnerable country Fiji, but also developed countries such as Spain, and those factors were actually pretty similar in both cases. And what that confirms to me is that while we might be very frustrated sometimes with the UNFCCC process in terms of perhaps the pace is not being in line with the urgency that we need to be able to address climate change, the importance of that process can't be underestimated, because this is still one of the decisive factors driving national action and the legal developments at the national level that actually lead to integration of net zero targets into the national policies. The other factors that came out as being very significant is the narrative around economic opportunity that net zero implementation brings, be it reducing reliance on imported fuels, or getting access to and leadership in low carbon technology markets. And finally, just transition narrative, what Jodiane has spoken about in terms of domestic implementation, came out across case studies as the key factor. And that was also confirmed by many side events where developing countries and developed countries shared how actually framing their national net zero policies and the specific measures they're implementing in different sectors deeply in the context of just transition is helping them to overcome potential opposition and get different sectors and groups of population on board and stakeholders with the implementation. Now, where do we stand in terms of readiness of national climate governance globally to actually implement net zero pledges? What we found out is we have looked at all of the climate laws globally that have already integrated net zero targets, and then assessed what is the focus of those pieces of legislation in terms of linkages to different parts of the climate governance infrastructure, and backed it up by specific national case studies. And what we find, which has also been confirmed by the discussions with different stakeholders at the COP from a variety of countries, is that globally, countries have made quite a lot of progress in terms of setting targets at the national level, so long-term objectives, and setting mechanisms for developing strategies. Many countries have already advanced in developing strategies. However, where we see critical gaps is on some of the other key governance pillars, namely setting effective coordination mechanisms at the national level, which are able to get different sectors working effectively together towards delivering on climate objectives. And that applies both to net zero and mitigation objectives, but also to adaptation. That is not a problem that is only relevant for a certain group of countries. This is actually across the board. Developed and developing countries are struggling with that. Some have done more progress. What we're noticing is that many climate laws or equivalent national climate frameworks set up different coordination bodies at the national level, but very often there is little detail in terms of who is in charge, how often the body has to meet, what they're expected to deliver. And most importantly, there is still lack of capacity in the key sectors, for example, in the Ministry of Finance, in the Ministries of Energy, Transport, who are very key for delivery on climate commitments. Oftentimes there are not yet still designated mechanisms to deliver on climate and to engage effectively with other ministries. And so in that context, Grantham Research Institute actually has been working over the past year and a half with the coalition of the Ministries of Finance, and we with colleagues have, and with contributions from many organizations around the world to this effort. We have developed a guide, for example, for the Ministry of Finance, to help them be more effective in their role of helping mobilize and channel finance to deliver on low carbon and climate resilient transition. And quite a lot of our efforts around COP has been, including in particular Nick Godfrey, our colleague, has been actually engaging with ministries of finance and with the coalition, sharing the learnings on how their role can be strengthened. Another important gap that we discovered through our research and also through discussions at the COP is coordination across the federal or national level and subnational level, and engaging regions and also ensuring that financing is available to the regional and local level to deliver on climate transition. And finally, two other areas which are very important is availability of nationally owned data, credible data. In many cases, we've discovered that sometimes net zero commitments politically are made before there is credible analysis available nationally on how to get there. And that creates quite a lot of pressure and challenge at the implementation stage. And in this context, this COP has highlighted the important role of independent advisory bodies such as Climate Change Committee in the UK and many equivalents internationally in helping address that gap and ensure that transition is backed by credible data and assessment. And finally, public participation. And I think as we're seeing a lot of backlash to climate policies in Europe, also in the UK and globally, there has been clear realization among governments and other stakeholders at this COP that unless public is brought with us on the goals and on the specifics of the policies which are being designed, it will be difficult to have effective implementation. So it's very encouraging that the COP decision, the Stocktake decision in point 9 reaffirms that meaningful, effective social dialogue and participation of all stakeholders is required. And there has been a lot of conversation and exchange among governments. How can you design public participation mechanisms to engage citizens early on, already at the stage of developing policies, rather than having public participation simply as afterthought and tick box exercise? So that is very encouraging and certainly a challenge to go forward. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alina. And thank you to all the speakers who can now put their cameras back on, and we'll move to the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you can still ask a question, put it in the Q&A. Vote for those your favorite. So we're going to move straight into questions. This one from an anonymous attendee. And it's a question for the whole panel. I'm not going to necessarily ask the whole panel to answer, but so the question is this: now that the UK has stepped back from being the climate leader it was at COP26, COP27, by licensing coal mines and North Sea oil and gas, what can be done to raise ambition in government and re-inspire confidence in businesses to invest in transition roadmaps? Some may dispute the premise of the question, but who wants to have a go at answering that? Nobody want to have a go? Alison, do you want to give a perspective? I mean, you don't have to accept the premise of it, but I wondered if you had a view on the challenges associated with the UK not just negotiating ambitious texts, but in being seen to be kind of acting on the outcomes of COPs.
Sure, I can speak to that. Thanks, Bob. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is I do think that the UK played a leadership role again at COP28, albeit in a different kind of guise, not being the presidency anymore. And you know, we pushed very strongly for the language on phase out of unabated fossil fuels because the UK is undergoing that transition. We still have our net zero commitment. We have our NDC, which is 68% reduction on 1990 levels by 2030. And to achieve all of those things, we are transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think what this plays into is also the concept of the need for a just transition, as has been talked about on this webcast as well. But the direction of travel in the UK is very much away from fossil fuels, and I think we'll continue to see that in the future. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you very much, Alison. Anybody else want to respond to this?
Bob, can I come in?
Yeah.
My views on the UK's backsliding are on the public record. I gave a speech in the House of Lords about 3 weeks ago, and I'm sure I don't know if the link's on the website, Bob, but it could be. I do think that the UK's leadership has been pretty good up to COP26. Actually outstanding, including for the reasons that Alison describes. But since COP26, less so. And I think the coal mine in the northwest of England, I think the very big expansion of drilling and exploration in the North Sea, I think the postponement of the time from 2030 to 2035, beyond which the sale of internal combustion vehicles would not be allowed, that constitutes quite substantial backsliding. And it doesn't take away the leadership over the past years, but it damages it. And people in COP and elsewhere are saying, what's going on? And I do think that that's important, because vacillation leads to uncertainty, it increases the cost of capital, and it damages investment. So I do think that the events of the last year or so in internal UK policy have not been helpful. But I would echo what Alison has said about the period really of a couple of decades or close to, where the UK has actually moved quite strongly, and I hope we'll pick up pace again.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. And we'll move on to the next question, which is for you, Nick, which is from Elena Almeida here at LSE. It's a question for you, Nick. It's, what is the likelihood of that the domestic finance can meet this $1 trillion financing target, particularly in globally high interest rate environment? And what are the domestic finance mechanisms available or suggested to meet this target?
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. Just a clarification, the 2.4 trillion flows in 2030 that we pointed to in emerging markets and developing countries outside China are overall investment flows in the area of energy transition, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and nature. If you look at, that's the overall investment flows in those areas. If you look at investment around the world, the majority of investment is generally financed domestically, partly off government budgets, government borrowing, including government borrowing, and partly from domestic capital markets. So on aggregate in those countries, we reckon that around 1.4 trillion of the 2.4 trillion would be financed domestically, and about 1 trillion externally. That fraction financed domestically is much lower than the world average, taking into account the difficult budgetary positions in many of the poorer countries. The ways forward domestically are basically through increased taxation and increased domestic borrowing, and the domestic of government and the domestic capital markets. And there are things one can do on all those fronts. The push forward of the value-added taxation across the developing world is a positive movement which could be taken much further. taxation of buildings and residents is something that could go much further. The digital advance in many developing countries also allow extra levers for taxation. So too, development in capital markets would be right across those areas, and obviously of particular importance the government revenue side, and there's a tremendous amount that can be done, recognizing that for some countries the capital markets and borrowing on the capital markets is either closed or very difficult. It's the job of the MDBs, the IMF, to help on the technical side of doing that, including in advancing in capital markets. But it would be wrong to assume that because developing countries are poor, they can't raise revenue and they can't develop their own capital markets. Those possibilities are there in all countries, but the numbers we've used recognize that it's more difficult in developing countries.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. I'm going to move to the next question. This one for Timo from Daniel Ospina at Future Earth. And Daniel asks, Timo, adaptation has always lagged way behind mitigation. Is it also now falling behind loss and damage? And if so, why is this? And what could be done to raise the attention it receives?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. In fact, that's what we've seen last year at COP27, which was earlier thought to be the Africa COP or the adaptation COP, but it was all about loss and damage, which of course with the outcome achieved was highly significant, but overshadowed adaptation. So the focus on the framework for the global goal has, if you want, brought attention back to adaptation. I think there was much more emphasis on adaptation at this COP than at the last COP. I wanted very briefly to get to the other question on why the Arab group blocked the negotiations, which I've forgotten to explain. So first it was the Arab group and the LMDCs, not the LDCs. That was the like-minded developing countries. And their overarching reason was, it has nothing to do with adaptation. It's more about common but differentiated responsibility. So it's this kind of fight over the principles of the convention versus what the Paris Agreement says. So it's this broader picture which apparently got them to block the negotiations in week one, which was quite unfortunate.
Thank you very much indeed.
Can I just add something on the numbers on loss and damage? In the calculations we made around that 2.4 trillion that I described of investment flows in emerging markets and developing countries by 2030, the numbers necessary for loss and damage would be a couple of $100 billion a year, per year, a couple of $100 billion a year or more. In that context, a fund with total value less than 1 billion has to be seen in proportion.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to add another question from Daniel here for Jodianne, which is now that COP28, and perhaps Alina might also want to address this. Now that COP28 is over, what are the key policy or diplomacy arenas that civil society ought to be paying attention to in the coming months to add pressure toward climate action? So Jodianne, do you want to have a go, and then maybe Alina?
Sure, thanks, Bob. That's a really good question, particularly given, as I mentioned, the just transition certainly does not just happen at COP. In fact, most of it happens outside of COP. So I think a few things to pay attention to that's really important. One is the ongoing proceedings at the International Court of Justice on the advisory opinions around states' responsibilities to climate action, especially in regards to future generations and for small island states. I think that the outcomes of that will have deep implications for climate justice and just transition. The second thing is the next phase of the nationally determined contributions and the meaningful incorporation of just transition elements in those submissions. We've seen, I think, at COP28, the role of subnational governments, specifically mayors, playing out quite strongly at COP28. And given that the just transition needs to happen with, a lot of contextual considerations and place-based implications, I think forums like the C40 for mayors will also have a huge role to play as well. And lastly, kind of civil society climate action networks, for example, around the world, are good spaces to elevate the just transition agenda as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, the Just Transition Work Program will be taking in submissions from parties and non-party stakeholders until mid-February. So another opportunity to also submit views and opinions as observer stakeholders as well.
Thank you. Alina, do you want to
Well, I
add
think
anything?
Georgian covered it pretty much. I think maybe one other area of cooperation to mention the cooperation among parliamentarians around the world. So Interparliamentary Union, Globe International Climate Parliament, and Commonwealth Secretariat, they're all running different initiatives to bring parliamentarians together and to exchange on climate. There is also there are also regional efforts, for example, in Europe, European climate governance, and discussions around the next round of national climate and energy plans that European countries have to submit, and the reform of the European climate governance regulation that is currently being discussed is a very important forum, because a lot of policy innovation is expected, hopefully, to come out of that. So I'll just add those in addition.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more quick question. So this one's for Alison, again from an anonymous attendee. We've seen reports that the final Global Stocktake text was approved without some of the islands states in the room who were still negotiating. Alison, can you cast light on that and on what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't there either at that point. But I mean, maybe just to say a few things. So the islands have got like an incredibly important voice in the COP process, and I think that is one of the big things about the COP process, is it gives that platform to the small island states, and they have done a lot to push forward the fossil fuel outcomes this year, but also loss and damage last year, and I think we see that consistently again and again. And to my understanding, but it was all we were all in the plenary, so it wasn't. It was very difficult to see who was there and who wasn't there. But my understanding is that they were still, as the Alliance of Small Island States, considering the text and whether it was a package that they wanted to accept or not. And they had they were just finishing that deliberation and going back to the plenary hall as the decision got gavelled through. So I think it's clear from what they have said that they weren't in their seats when it was gavelled through, and they read their response, and I think that's a shame. And I think it's I don't know what happened because I wasn't involved. But I guess the main thing I would say from our perspective is that it is incredibly important that those voices from the islands are heard. And I think that the points that they made on, the concern over loopholes, they need to do more to keep 1.5 in reach. They need to do more on finance across the piece. I think we're all heard loud and clear by the plenary after the fact. So maybe that's all I'll say on that. But as you're moving on from questions, I mean, maybe just I've seen a couple of other things in the chat, just maybe to very quickly respond to. So one is on Article 6, really disappointing that we didn't get an outcome. But from our perspective, it was better to not get an outcome than compromise on environmental integrity. And I think there's going to be a lot of work next year to step up the Article 6 negotiations and to try and build some of the bridges there, because we need these carbon markets to be up and running. In terms of what COPs can do, I think they can't do everything, but they can send really important signals, and it's then up to us to kind of take forward those signals and put them into practice. And then on a few questions about Azerbaijan, they've already started to engage with us. They're clearly taking their role seriously. I think it's fair to say that they're not a country that we have engaged with significantly in the past on climate, but I think we need to give them a chance to come out and set their agenda as presidency. And one of the things that they have been clear on is that they will want to work with the UAE and Brazil in almost like a troika for the next few years. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Alison, for answering the question and for picking up those others. And just goes to show it's never too soon to start thinking about the next COP. So we've run out of time. So I just want to thank everybody. Thank all our panelists, Alison Campbell, Nick Stern, Sima Leiter, Jodianne Wang, and Alina Avchankova for providing their expert insights. Thank you to the audience for all the questions and for being with us for this event. And thank you in particular to Alex Burrows, who has behind the scenes organized all this. There will be this recording of this event will be available on the website shortly. So if there's anybody you know who wanted to come along but couldn't join us live, they'll be able to have a look on the website very shortly. Thank you to everybody again, and have a happy holiday. Thank you all. Bye-bye.